Okay, so last chapter for algebra. We are going to split this into 2Ds. Today's part of it is going to be short and sweet, and it's going to have an easy assignment on Google Classroom, and then tomorrow we'll get into the graphing. So today we're just going to talk about what a square root function is. So for your notes here at the top, a square root function is a function that contains a square root with the independent variable in the radicand. Lots of words, right? All that means is that x is under the square root. Okay? So the most basic function, square root function, is y equals the square root of x. That's the basic. Just like it's y equals mx plus b, or y equals mx, y equals ax squared. This is the basic for square root. What we have to remember is the value of the radicand. So what's underneath the radicand, or the radical, cannot be negative. Okay? So to find the domain, remember your domain is your x, okay? It can never be negative. So all you need to do for each one is set whatever's under the radical greater than or equal to 0 and solve. When we set it greater than or equal to 0, it has to be positive. So for this example, we have x minus 5 underneath. So we're going to set x minus 5 greater than or equal to 0. To solve that, you just add 5 to both sides. X is greater than or equal to 5. That is your domain. So if I put a 5 in here, I'll get the square root of 0, which is 0. If I put a 6 in, I'll get the square root of 1. 7, square root of 2, and so on. If it was any lower than 5, like 4, if I put a 4 in there, you'd have the square root of a negative 1, and you cannot have that. So for these examples on the front, the square y equals 10 square root of x. X is underneath. So to find your domain, you let whatever is underneath be greater than or equal to 0. If it's just an x, you're finished. Same thing here. This 7 is not under the square root. So again, domain, x is greater than or equal to 0. Number 3, this whole thing is underneath. Negative x plus 1 greater than or equal to 0. So you want to subtract 1 from both sides. So you get negative x greater than or equal to negative 1. Remember, when you divide both sides by a negative 1, hopefully you guys remember, you have to flip that sign. So the domain is x is less than or equal to 1. So if I put a 2 in here, underneath the square root would be negative, and we cannot have that. Same thing for 4. Negative x plus 5 has to be greater than or equal to 0. Subtract 5 from both sides. Negative x greater than or equal to negative 5. Divide by a negative 1. Divide by a negative 1. You have to flip the sign. So that's what the domain has to be. Okay? So we're going to skip the graphs at the bottom, and then we're going to go to the back of this, and we're going to just skip those graphs. We're going to go right in the middle. What I would suggest right now is you guys pause it, solve for the domain, and then check your answers. So I'm going to keep going. X is underneath the square root, the domain. X is greater than or equal to 0. Again, x greater than or equal to 0. This one, negative x minus 2 is under the square root. I'm going to add 2 to both sides. Negative x greater than or equal to 2. Divide by a negative 1. So I'm going to go over here. So flip the sign. X has to be less than or equal to negative 2. And these are all about the domains. For this one, x plus 3 greater than or equal to 0. You subtract 3 from both sides, greater than or equal to negative 3. And then you keep going. 5 minus x greater than or equal to 0. Subtract 5. Divide by a negative 1. X is less than or equal to 5. And then x plus 1 greater than or equal to 0, subtract 1. X is greater than or equal to negative 1. So all we did today was find the domain. To find the domain, whatever's underneath the square root, you set greater than or equal to 0. Just a reminder, whenever you divide or multiply by a negative, you have to flip the inequality sign. Okay, so this is pretty easy. Keep these notes for tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to graph. Have a good one.